February 9, 1944. North Atlantic, 400 miles west of Ireland. The water was black and cold, heaving under a winter gale that clawed at the hull of HMS Starling as she cut through the swells at 8 knots. Inside the operations room, 48-year-old Captain Frederic John Walker, known to every man in the fleet as Johnny, stood over the plotting table, his face drawn with exhaustion, his eyes fixed on the glowing trace of the ASDIC screen. Beneath them, somewhere in the crushing darkness 500 feet down, a German U-boat was running silent, its crew holding their breath, waiting for the British warships above to give up and move on. They had been hunting this submarine for 6 hours. 6 brutal, relentless hours of cat and mouse in the freezing Atlantic. But Walker was not going to give up. He never did. And tonight, he was about to demonstrate why the German Navy had come to fear his name more than any other commander in the Royal Navy. The stakes could not have been higher. By early 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had become the longest, bloodiest campaign of the Second World War. A savage struggle for control of the convoy routes that kept Britain alive. Since 1939, German U-boats had sent thousands of Allied merchant ships to the bottom, drowning sailors and cargo alike, threatening to starve Britain into submission. Winston Churchill himself would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. For nearly 5 years, the submarines had held the advantage. They struck from the depths without warning, vanishing before escorts could retaliate. In the first years of the war, the odds were crushingly in their favor. Depth charge attacks, the primary weapon against submerged submarines, succeeded only 5% of the time under ideal conditions. In actual combat, that figure dropped to 3%. A U-boat commander with steady nerves and a deep-diving boat could evade attack after attack, leaving frustrated escorts circling above empty water while the submarine slipped away into the dark. But something had changed. Between 1942 and 1944, the kill rate for depth charge attacks had risen from 3% to 45%. A 15-fold improvement that transformed the Atlantic from a U-boat hunting ground into a graveyard for German submariners. The weapon itself had not fundamentally changed. The Mark 7 depth charge still weighed 290 pounds, still packed the same Torpex explosive, still had to detonate within 26 feet of a submarine's pressure hull to cause serious damage. What had changed were the tactics. Specifically, a set of unorthodox, resource-intensive attack patterns developed by one man whose obsessive dedication to killing U-boats would ultimately cost him his life. These tactics were so expensive in terms of time, fuel, and ammunition that they were initially discouraged by Admiralty officials who viewed them as wasteful. Ships were meant to escort convoys, not chase individual submarines for hours or days. Depth charges were meant to be dropped judiciously, not expended by the dozens in single attacks. But Walker had no interest in judicious. He had studied the U-boat problem for 20 years, and he knew that half measures achieved nothing. To kill submarines, you needed overwhelming force, perfect coordination, and a willingness to exhaust every resource at your disposal. The tactics he developed, particularly the creeping attack and the barrage attack, would prove devastatingly effective. They would also earn him a reputation as the most successful anti-submarine commander of the war, credited with the destruction of 20 U-boats. And on this freezing night in February 1944, Walker's second support group was about to demonstrate exactly why these supposedly forbidden methods worked. The desperate problem, when technology failed. To understand why Walker's tactics represented such a radical departure, one must first understand the fundamental problem that had plagued anti-submarine warfare since the beginning of the war. The British had developed ASDIC, named after the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee and later known as sonar, in the years after the First World War. The device consisted of an electronic sound transmitter and receiver housed in a metal dome beneath a ship's hull. It sent out pulses of sound that would bounce off submerged objects and return as echoes, allowing operators to detect and track submarines underwater. On paper, ASDIC promised to make the submarine obsolete. In reality, it had severe limitations that German U-boat commanders learned to exploit with deadly efficiency. The most critical flaw was geometric. ASDIC surged forward, projecting its sound beam ahead of the ship in a cone-shaped pattern. The attacking vessel would detect a submerged U-boat, plot its course and depth, then increase speed and steer toward the target. But as the ship closed in and passed directly over the submarine, the ASDIC lost contact. The device could not search directly beneath the vessel. This created a blind spot, a window of opportunity lasting anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, during which the submarine became invisible to the hunters above. And in that blind spot, everything changed. U-boat commanders quickly learned to recognize the moment when an attacking escort lost ASDIC contact. They would hear the thrashing of propellers growing louder as the warship accelerated for the attack run. Then the characteristic change in sound as the escort passed overhead. In that critical window, a skilled commander would order emergency turns, sometimes changing depth simultaneously, moving the submarine away from its last known position. When the depth charges detonated seconds later, the U-boat would be elsewhere, close enough to be rattled by the explosions, close enough for the crew to be thrown against bulkheads and for light bulbs to shatter, but far enough away for the pressure hull to survive intact. The submarine would then continue evasive maneuvers while the attacking ship, its ASDIC temporarily deafened by its own depth charge explosions, struggled to regain contact. By the time the water settled and the echolocation equipment could function again, the U-boat might have traveled several hundred yards in any direction, forcing the escort to begin the search again from scratch. The mathematics were brutal. A standard depth charge had to explode within approximately 26 feet of a submarine to inflict lethal damage to the pressure hull. Beyond that distance, the force of the underwater explosion dissipated too rapidly to rupture the thick steel. Submarines of the Type 7 and Type 9 classes, the workhorses of the German U-boat fleet, were engineered to withstand enormous pressure at depth. Their hulls could resist the crushing force of seawater at 750 feet, which made them extraordinarily resistant to nearby explosions as well. A depth charge detonating 50 feet away might shake the boat violently, crack some gauges, start a few leaks, and terrify the crew, but it would not sink the submarine. And in the chaos of combat, with the target maneuvering wildly during the blind spot and the attacking ship having to estimate where the submarine would be by the time the slowly sinking depth charges reached the target's depth, achieving that 26-foot radius became a matter of luck more than skill. The statistics told the story of failure. During the first 6 months of the war, Royal Navy escorts conducted approximately 4,000 depth charge attacks against suspected submarine contacts. These attacks resulted in only 33 confirmed kills, a success rate of less than 1%. Even accounting for the fact that many contacts were false or that some attacks caused damage that forced U-boats to abort patrols, the numbers were catastrophic. The submarines were winning. German production was launching new U-boats faster than the Allies could sink them, and each submarine that survived its first patrol would go on to sink more ships, gain more experience, become more dangerous. Merchant shipping losses mounted steadily. In November 1942 alone, U-boats sank 118 Allied merchant ships totaling over 700,000 tons. The convoys were bleeding to death, and the escorts were powerless to stop it. For the men in the escorts, the frustration was agonizing. They could detect the U-boats. They could track them, at least for a while. They would race toward the target, drop their depth charges with precision timing, feel the satisfying crump of underwater explosions, watch the columns of white water erupt from the sea, and then regain ASDIC contact only to find the submarine still alive, still moving, slipping away into the depths. Survivors of U-boat attacks would be plucked from the freezing water. Men who had watched their ships torn apart by torpedo explosions, who had seen their crewmates drown or freeze, and the escort crews could do nothing but rage impotently at the invisible enemy below. Some U-boats survived hundreds of depth charge attacks. U-427, operating in April 1945, endured 678 depth charges over multiple engagements and returned to port. The German submariners developed dark humor about it, calling the depth charges ash cans, and joking that they were more likely to die from boredom than from British explosions. They knew the odds favored their survival. The Admiralty knew they had a problem. Various solutions were proposed. Scientists worked on improving ASDIC sensitivity and developing forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog that could maintain contact during the attack. Engineers designed faster-sinking depth charges to reduce the time available for evasive maneuvers. Tacticians revised attack patterns, recommending that escorts drop charges in geometric patterns. Diamonds, rectangles, lines, to cover more area and compensate for uncertainty about the target's precise location. But none of these solutions addressed the fundamental issue. A single ship, attacking alone, had to surrender ASDIC contact at the moment of attack. And in that moment, the U-boat escaped. The unlikely solution and its architect, a man out of place. The man who would solve this problem seemed, on the surface, an unlikely candidate for greatness. Frederic John Walker was born on June 3, 1896, in Plymouth, the son of a Royal Navy officer. He entered the service as a cadet in 1909, educated at the Royal Naval Colleges at Osborne and Dartmouth, where he excelled academically. He served as a midshipman aboard the battleship Ajax during the First World War, then moved to destroyers in 1916 and 1917. After the war, he joined HMS Valiant, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, and married Jessica Eileen Ryder Stobart, with whom he would have 3 sons and a daughter. His career followed a conventional path through the interwar years. Steady promotions, competent service, no particular distinction. But in 1924, something changed. Walker took a course at the newly founded anti-submarine warfare training school, HMS Osprey, on the Isle of Portland. The school had been established to study the lessons of the U-boat campaigns of the First World War and develop countermeasures for any future conflict. Walker became fascinated, obsessed even with the problem of hunting submarines. He threw himself into the technical details, the physics of underwater sound propagation, the behavior of pressure hulls under stress, the tactics of submarine evasion, the performance characteristics of depth charges and ASDIC systems. He was promoted to commander in May 1933 and given command of the destroyer Shikari, then the sloop Falmouth on the China station. In April 1937, he returned to HMS Osprey as the experimental commander, putting him in charge of developing and testing new anti-submarine tactics. Walker's colleagues found him intense, driven, sometimes difficult. He had strong opinions about how submarines should be hunted, and he did not suffer fools or bureaucratic resistance gladly. He was also, critically, not a natural politician. In a navy where advancement often depended as much on social connections and diplomatic skills as on technical competence, Walker's single-minded focus on anti-submarine warfare and his impatience with administrative niceties worked against him. When the Second World War began in September 1939, Walker was assigned as Operations Staff Officer to Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, an important post but not a command. He watched from headquarters as the U-boats savaged the convoys, as merchant ships burned and sank, as the escorts flailed ineffectually with their depth charges. He had spent 15 years studying this problem, developing theories about how to kill submarines, and the Admiralty had him pushing papers in an office. He did, at least, have the opportunity to participate in one of the war's great operations. In May and June 1940, Walker served on the staff that organized Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. Over 338,000 British and French troops were rescued from the collapsing pocket and brought back to England or to Brittany. A strategic disaster transformed into a propaganda victory. Walker was mentioned in dispatches for his staff work during the operation, but it must have galled him to be coordinating other men's actions when he wanted desperately to be at sea, hunting U-boats. Finally, in October 1941, more than 2 years after the war began, Walker received a command. He was given the 36th Escort Group, commanding from the Bittern-class sloop HMS Stork. The group consisted of 2 sloops and 6 corvettes, based at Gladstone Dock in Bootle, near the headquarters of Western Approaches Command in Liverpool. At 45 years old, Walker was finally going to get his chance to test his theories in combat. His group was initially assigned to escort convoys to and from Gibraltar, long, dangerous runs through waters infested with U-boats. The crews quickly learned that their new commander was unlike anyone they had served under before. Walker drove them relentlessly, drilling attack procedures, timing every phase of every evolution, demanding split-second coordination between ships. He worked them until they could execute complex maneuvers in the dark, in heavy weather without radio communication. Some grumbled about the intensity of the training, but Walker told them simply, "We are going to hunt U-boats, and we are going to kill them. Everything we do must serve that purpose." In December 1941, Walker's chance came. The 36th Escort Group was assigned to protect convoy HG-76, 32 merchant ships sailing from Gibraltar to Britain. Intelligence indicated that a U-boat wolf pack was waiting for them. Walker welcomed the confrontation. As the convoy steamed north through the Bay of Biscay, the U-boats attacked repeatedly, and Walker's group responded with a fury that shocked the German commanders. Over the course of the battle, 5 U-boats were sunk, 4 of them by Walker's ships. The first kill came on December 17th, when HMS Deptford destroyed U-131 with depth charges. The next night, HMS Blankney sank U-434. On December 19th, Walker's own ship, HMS Stork, detected U-574 on the surface attempting to close the convoy. Stork raced toward the submarine, firing star shells to illuminate it. The U-boat crash-dived, but Walker's ASDIC operator held contact. Stork dropped a precise pattern of depth charges that brought the submarine back to the surface, damaged and unable to dive. Walker then did something few commanders had the nerve to attempt. He ordered full speed ahead and rammed the U-boat, his ship's bow crashing into the submarine's hull, crushing it. U-574 sank immediately, taking most of its crew with it. Walker later calmly reported that ramming seemed the most expeditious method of dispatch. The convoy lost the escort carrier HMS Audacity, the destroyer HMS Stanley, and 2 merchant ships. Painful losses, but far less than would have been expected against such a concentrated U-boat attack. This was later described as the first true Allied convoy victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, and Walker was awarded the Distinguished Service Order on January 6, 1942. The citation praised his daring, skill, and determination, and noted that his actions had sunk 3 submarines. But what the citation did not mention, what Walker had discovered during the battle, was that his theories about coordinated attacks were correct. During some of the engagements, when multiple escorts worked together, they had been far more effective than ships attacking individually. The seed of the creeping attack had been planted. The battle of development, perfecting the forbidden methods. Walker's success with convoy HG-76 earned him promotion to captain in June 1942, backdated to June 30, 1942, and a bar to his DSO in July. But it also earned him something more valuable, credibility with the higher command. In October 1942, Walker was brought ashore to serve as Captain D. Liverpool, a staff position that was ostensibly a rest from sea duty, but which Walker used to develop his tactical theories further. He had 6 months to think, to analyze, to refine. And when he returned to sea in April 1943, it was to command something new, the Second Support Group. The support groups were a recent innovation, created at the crisis point of the Battle of the Atlantic. Unlike traditional escort groups, which were tied to specific convoys and could not leave their charges to pursue contacts, support groups were free-ranging hunter-killer units. They would reinforce convoys under attack, yes, but they were also empowered to spend days, if necessary, tracking down and destroying individual U-boats. This was exactly what Walker had been advocating for years. Give him ships that were not bound by the defensive requirements of convoy escort, and he could take the fight to the submarines. He could hunt them to exhaustion. The second support group consisted of 6 sloops of the Black Swan class: HMS Starling, Walker's flagship, HMS Wren, HMS Woodpecker, HMS Signet, HMS Wild Goose, and HMS Kite. These were excellent anti-submarine vessels, purpose-built submarine hunters with good endurance, adequate speed, and specialized anti-submarine armament including depth charge racks and throwers. 3 of the ships, including Starling, were brand new. None had worked together before. Walker had 4 weeks to turn them into a cohesive fighting unit. He began with the creeping attack. The tactic had evolved from Walker's analysis of the ASDIC blind spot problem. If one ship attacking alone lost contact during the final approach, then the solution was to use 2 ships. One ship would remain stationary, maintaining ASDIC contact with the target submarine from approximately 1,500 yards away. This ship, the directing ship, would continuously track the U-boat's position and movements. The second ship, the attacking ship, would approach the target slowly and silently, moving at 4 or 5 knots, making as little noise as possible. Critically, the attacking ship would not use its ASDIC. It would approach from behind the submarine, using the submarine's own engine noise to mask its approach. The U-boat crew, hearing the directing ship's ASDIC pings and maintaining awareness of its position, would not realize that a second threat was creeping up behind them. As the attacking ship moved into position, the directing ship would guide it using directional signals, flags during daylight, signal lamps at night, or later, secure radio transmissions. The directing ship's ASDIC operator would track the submarine continuously, calculating its depth, course, and speed. When the attacking ship reached the optimal position directly above the target, the directing ship would signal now, and the attacking ship would release its depth charges. The U-boat, unaware of the silent stalker above it, would have no opportunity for last-second evasive maneuvers. And because the directing ship maintained ASDIC contact throughout the entire attack, there was no blind spot, no gap in awareness. If the first attack missed or merely damaged the submarine, the directing ship would immediately vector the attacking ship back for another pass, and another, until the U-boat was destroyed or forced to surface. The creeping attack was elegant in theory. In practice, it was fiendishly difficult. The two ships had to maintain perfect coordination while separated by a mile or more of ocean, often in darkness, heavy weather, or both. The directing ship's ASDIC operator had to track not only the submarine but also the friendly vessel, calculating ranges and bearings to both contacts simultaneously. The attacking ship's captain had to trust the distant director completely, steering his ship by external signals without being able to verify the target's position himself. Any mistake, a miscalculation of the submarine's depth, an error in communicating bearing, a moment of inattention, would result in depth charges falling harmlessly away from the target, wasting ammunition and alerting the U-boat that it was under silent attack. Walker drilled his ships obsessively on the procedure. He would have one ship submerge a practice submarine, or simply mark a position on the ocean as a theoretical target, and then run the creeping attack profile again and again. Starling would hold the contact. Wild Goose would creep in. Then Kite would hold contact while Woodpecker attacked. Then Cygnet and Wren. The crews learned to read each other's signals in seconds, to communicate with minimal radio transmissions that might be intercepted by U-boats. They learned to trust the coordinated system more than their own individual perceptions. And slowly, the second support group became a unified weapon. But Walker was not finished. The creeping attack worked beautifully against submarines at moderate depth, 200 to 400 feet, where standard depth charge patterns could be effective. But German U-boat commanders had learned that diving deep offered a refuge. Most Royal Navy depth charges in the early war years had maximum settings of 500 or 600 feet. Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats had test depths of 750 feet, and in emergencies, some commanders would take their boats even deeper, accepting the risk of hull collapse from water pressure in exchange for escaping the depth charges exploding harmlessly above them. A U-boat at extreme depth could not maneuver quickly. The pressure was too great, the risk of implosion too high, but it could sit and wait, hoping the escorts would exhaust their ammunition and leave. And that, Walker realized, required a different solution. He called it the Barrage Attack, though his crews referred to it as the boss's special. The principle was simple: overwhelming force. If a single pattern of 10 depth charges had only a small chance of hitting a deep-diving U-boat in the critical 26-foot kill radius, then the solution was not more precise single patterns. It was saturation. The Barrage Attack used 3 ships moving in line abreast, typically spaced 200 to 300 yards apart. All 3 ships would steam over the estimated position of the deep U-boat. At a signal from the directing ship, often Starling with Walker aboard, all 3 vessels would simultaneously release depth charges in rapid sequence. Not a single pattern of 10 charges, but multiple patterns from each ship, one after another, carpeting the entire area. A full barrage attack might expend 60 to 80 depth charges in a single pass. The cumulative effect was devastating. Even if no single charge scored a direct hit within the kill radius, the sheer number of near-simultaneous explosions created converging pressure waves that propagated through the water from multiple directions. The submarine's pressure hull would be subjected to shock after shock, each one straining the welds, cracking the plates, starting leaks. Systems would fail, electrical panels would short out, ballast pumps would jam, trim controls would become inoperative. Battery compartments flooded with seawater would generate chlorine gas, poisoning the crew. Hull plates would buckle. And even if the submarine survived the initial barrage, it would be crippled, unable to maneuver, losing depth control, often forced to surface involuntarily. The barrage attack was, as Royal Navy records noted, expensive in terms of resources. A sloop typically carried 40 to 60 depth charges. A single barrage attack might consume 2/3 of a ship's ammunition. If the attack failed, the ship would have to withdraw to replenish, which could take days if the supply ships were far away. Admiralty officials questioned whether it was prudent to expend so much ammunition on a single target. Walker's response was blunt. What good were depth charges sitting in the magazine when U-boats were sinking ships? The only purpose of ammunition was to kill the enemy. If it took 80 depth charges to destroy a U-boat, then use 80 depth charges. A dead submarine could not sink convoys. The Admiralty reluctantly agreed to allow Walker to test his methods operationally, but there was resistance. Some senior officers viewed the support group concept as a wasteful diversion of resources from convoy escort duties. Others felt that pursuing individual submarines for extended periods was inefficient compared to protecting merchant ships directly. And there were concerns about the creeping attack specifically. It was slow, it required two ships working in close coordination, and if the U-boat detected the approach, it could potentially ambush the silent stalker. These tactics were not explicitly forbidden, but they were certainly unconventional, resource-intensive, and outside the standard doctrine. Walker was, in effect, being given enough rope to either vindicate his theories or prove them impractical. The proof would come in combat. The enemy's fatal blind spot, German arrogance and doctrine. While Walker refined his tactics, the German U-boat command remained confident. They had reason to be. Despite increasing losses through 1942 and early 1943, German submarine construction was still outpacing Allied sinking rates. Admiral Karl Donitz, commander of the U-boat fleet and later commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy, maintained that with enough submarines operating simultaneously, the Allies could be bled white. The Wolfpack tactics, coordinated group attacks on convoys, had proven their effectiveness. The Type 7 U-boat was a mature, reliable design that could cross the Atlantic, remain on station for weeks, and return home. The crews were increasingly experienced, with many commanders having survived multiple patrols and learned all the tricks for evading depth charge attacks. German tactical doctrine for dealing with depth charge attacks was well developed. When an escort made ASDIC contact and began an approach, the U-boat would turn toward the attacker and accelerate, aiming to pass beneath the escort and emerge on the other side in the opposite direction. As the escort passed overhead and lost ASDIC contact, the submarine would execute a rapid change of course, often 90 degrees or more, and if possible change depth as well. By the time the depth charges detonated, the U-boat would ideally be several hundred feet away from the explosions. If the attack continued, the submarine would dive deeper, seeking the safety of extreme depth where Allied depth charges could not reach. Experienced commanders took pride in their ability to read the attack patterns, to sense the moment when the escort lost contact, to slip away like ghosts. What German doctrine did not account for, what German intelligence had not detected, was the development of coordinated attack tactics. The creeping attack, in particular, exploited a fundamental assumption in U-boat doctrine, that the submarine could monitor the position of all threats by listening to ASDIC pulses and propeller noise. A U-boat crew could track an attacking escort by the increasing volume of its engines, could hear the moment when it lost contact and passed overhead, could estimate when the depth charges would be dropped. But if one escort was making ASDIC contact while a second escort crept up silently from behind, if the directing ship was maintaining continuous contact through the blind spot, then all those carefully honed evasion tactics became useless. The U-boat would maneuver based on the position of the loud, obvious threat, unaware that the real danger was approaching undetected. Similarly, the barrage attack exploited German confidence in the survivability of their submarines. U-boat crews had experienced so many depth charge attacks that had failed to sink them, had heard so many explosions that had merely rattled the boat, that they had developed a certain contempt for Allied anti-submarine capabilities. Depth charges were frightening, yes, the underwater explosions were loud enough to rupture eardrums, violent enough to throw men to the deck, but they rarely scored direct hits. A well-built Type 7 could take tremendous punishment. German naval architects had done their work well. The circular pressure hull was enormously strong. So when escorts began conducting conventional attacks, German commanders would dive deep and wait them out, confident that the Allies would eventually exhaust their ammunition and leave. They did not anticipate that a commander might bring 3 ships over their position simultaneously and drop 60 depth charges in a single, overwhelming barrage. The cumulative shock effect was something no submarine had been designed to withstand. There was also, perhaps, an element of hubris. The German Navy had pioneered submarine warfare in the First World War and perfected it in the Second. The U-boat service was an elite force, volunteers only, with rigorous training and a proud tradition. They had brought Britain to the brink of starvation in 1917 and were doing it again in 1942 and 1943. Yes, losses were increasing, but that was expected as the Allies devoted more resources to anti-submarine warfare. The fundamental equation still favored the submarines. They could strike from invisibility, choose their targets, withdraw before retaliation. The Royal Navy's escorts were competent, but they were not truly dangerous. Except that now they were. And the U-boat command was slow to realize it. The reversal, battlefield shock. The second support group became operational in April 1943. For the first weeks, they escorted convoys and conducted anti-submarine patrols without major contact. Then, in June, everything changed. On June 2, 1943, while escorting a convoy, Starling gained ASDIC contact with a submerged U-boat. Walker immediately detached from the convoy and began a pursuit that would last 14 hours. U-202, a Type WWII submarine under the command of Captain Lieutenant Gunter Poser, had been operating in the North Atlantic for 3 weeks, hunting for convoy targets. Now Poser found himself hunted. Walker deployed the creeping attack. Wild Goose held ASDIC contact while Starling crept in silently. The first attack damaged U-202 but did not sink it. Poser, an experienced commander with 8 patrols behind him, dove deep and attempted to evade. But Wild Goose never lost contact. Walker vectored Starling back for another attack, then another. Hours passed. The submarine could not shake its pursuers. Every time Poser thought he had slipped away, another pattern of depth charges would explode around his boat. The hull began to develop leaks. Electrical systems failed. The air grew foul. Finally, after 14 hours of relentless pursuit, U-202 lost depth control and surfaced involuntarily. Starling immediately opened fire with deck guns. Poser ordered his crew to abandon ship and scuttled the submarine. 45 men, including Poser, were rescued by the British ships. The interrogation reports documented their shock. They had never experienced such sustained, accurate attacks. It was as if the British had known exactly where U-202 was at every moment. 3 weeks later, on June 24, 1943, Walker's group encountered U-119, a Type XB submarine, a large mine-laying boat that also served as a supply submarine for other U-boats. The engagement followed a similar pattern: initial ASDIC contact, creeping attacks, relentless pursuit. But U-119's commander, Captain Lieutenant Alois Zek, chose to fight on the surface rather than surrender. Starling closed the range and rammed the submarine at full speed, crushing its hull. U-119 sank immediately, taking most of its crew to the bottom. On the same day, Woodpecker and Wren sank U-449 with depth charges after a shorter engagement. 3 U-boats destroyed in 3 weeks. Walker was demonstrating that his methods worked. But the vindication came in late July 1943, in a single engagement that stunned the Admiralty and terrified the U-boat command. On July 30th, while patrolling the Bay of Biscay, Walker's group encountered a group of 3 U-boats traveling together on the surface. 2 were Type 14 submarines, huge replenishment boats nicknamed milk cows that carried fuel, torpedoes, and supplies to resupply operational U-boats at sea. These submarines were critical to extending the range and endurance of the attack boats, allowing them to remain on patrol far longer than would otherwise be possible. The third was a Type 9 attack submarine. Walker immediately signaled General Chase, an old cavalry term meaning pursue at maximum speed, and all 6 ships of the second support group raced toward the targets. The U-boats attempted to crash dive, but Walker's ships closed too quickly, firing their deck guns to inflict damage that prevented the submarines from submerging. Within minutes, all 3 U-boats were damaged and unable to dive. Then Walker methodically destroyed them. U-462 was sunk by Starling, Wild Goose, and Woodpecker using depth charges and gunfire. U-504 was sunk by Kite, Cygnet, and Wren. U-461, the second milk cow, managed to partially submerge but was then destroyed by an Australian short Sunderland flying boat that had responded to Walker's contact reports. 3 critical submarines destroyed in a single afternoon. Donitz was furious when he learned of the losses. The Type 14 replenishment boats were few in number and could not be quickly replaced. Losing 2 in one engagement was a strategic disaster. The Germans began to suspect that something had changed in British anti-submarine tactics, but they did not understand what. Survivors' reports spoke of unusually persistent pursuit, of attacks that seemed to know exactly where the submarines were even after evasive maneuvers. German naval intelligence speculated about improved ASDIC, about possible code breaking, about traitors providing information. They did not guess the truth, that the British had simply learned to use 2 ships where before they had used 1, and to use overwhelming force where before they had been frugal. For Walker, the success came with personal cost. In early August 1943, shortly after returning to base, he learned that his son, Timothy Walker, had been killed when the submarine HMS Parthian was lost in the Mediterranean. Walker showed no outward emotion. He accepted the condolences of his officers, then returned to work, planning the next patrol. Those who knew him well said that something changed in him after that he became even more relentless, even more driven, as if killing U-boats had become personal in a way it had not been before. In September 1943, Walker was appointed a Companion of the Order of the Bath, with a citation praising his leadership and daring in command of HMS Starling in successful actions against enemy submarines in the Atlantic. In November, the 2nd Support Group sank 2 more U-boats, U-226 and U-842, in a single operation. And then came the patrol that would make Walker a legend. The expansion, 6 U-boats in 1 patrol. In January 1944, the 2nd Support Group departed Liverpool for what would become its most famous operation. Intelligence indicated that U-boats were concentrating in the western approaches, targeting convoys bound for Britain. Walker intended to hunt them down. The patrol would last 3 weeks. By the end of it, Walker's ships would have sunk 6 U-boats, a record that has never been equaled in a single patrol by any anti-submarine unit in history. The first kill came on January 31st, 1944. Starling and Wild Goose gained ASDIC contact with U-592, a Type WWII submarine, and pursued it for 8 hours using repeated creeping attacks. The submarine attempted every evasion tactic in the German handbook. Radical course changes, extreme depth diving, even stopping engines and lying motionless on the seabed, hoping the British would give up. Walker did not give up. Wild Goose maintained contact while Starling delivered attack after attack. Finally, U-592 surfaced, its hull ruptured, and sank moments later. Only 4 men from the crew of 50 survived. 8 days later, on the night of February 9, 1944, the night described at the beginning of this narrative, the 2nd Support Group achieved the impossible. They sank 3 U-boats in a single action. The engagement began when Starling gained ASDIC contact with a submarine at extreme depth. Walker brought in Wild Goose and Woodpecker to form a line abreast, then signaled for a barrage attack. The 3 ships steamed over the target area and released their depth charges in a synchronized pattern, over 60 charges detonating within 5 minutes. The submarine, later identified as U-762, was caught in the converging pressure waves. Its hull buckled and collapsed. A massive underwater implosion was heard on the ASDIC sets of all 3 ships, followed by the sounds of tearing metal and escaping air. U-762 broke apart at depth. There were no survivors. As the ships regained their positions, they detected another U-boat contact approximately 10 miles ahead. Magpie and Kite were dispatched to investigate. What followed was a running battle that lasted through the night. The submarine was later identified as U-734, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Hans Hermann Stuckmann, an experienced officer who had survived 7 previous patrols. Stuckmann was skilled and aggressive. He fired multiple acoustic homing torpedoes, weapons designed to home in on the propeller noise of escort vessels, at his pursuers. The torpedoes were terrifyingly effective weapons when they worked, capable of tracking a ship through its own engine noise and striking without warning. But Walker had developed a countermeasure. As one torpedo approached Starling, its wake visible in the moonlight, Walker calmly ordered the ship to turn hard to port, then dropped 2 depth charges set to shallow depth immediately. The charges exploded just behind Starling's stern, creating a massive pressure wave that detonated the incoming torpedo seconds before it would have struck. The double explosion, the depth charges followed immediately by the torpedo, nearly blew Starling's stern off, but the ship survived. Walker then ordered all ships to attack U-734 simultaneously with everything they had. Over the next hour, Wild Goose, Starling, Kite, and Magpie delivered multiple creeping and barrage attacks, expending over 40 depth charges. U-734 was finally destroyed by the cumulative shock damage. An oil slick and debris field marked the grave of 52 more German submariners. Meanwhile, Kite and Magpie had detected yet another U-boat. This time the submarine, U-238, attempted a bold move. It surfaced suddenly and raced past Kite at high speed, attempting to escape in the darkness. Kite immediately opened fire and turned to pursue, dropping a shallow set depth charge that by sheer luck struck the U-boat's hull before exploding. The explosion was massive, far larger than a standard depth charge detonation, and Kite herself was nearly destroyed by the blast. But when the spray cleared, Kite was still afloat, though her quarterdeck was buckled and her depth charge rails bent. The U-boat had crash-dived and was damaged. Walker brought Starling over to support. By this time, the submarine was moving slowly at extreme depth, clearly crippled but still dangerous. Walker then improvised something that had never been attempted before. Magpie was the only ship in the group equipped with a Hedgehog launcher, a forward-throwing weapon that fired 24 small high-explosive projectiles in a pattern ahead of the ship. Hedgehog was normally used at close range with the firing ship's own ASDIC guiding the attack. But Walker decided to use Starling's ASDIC to control Magpie remotely. He positioned Starling to maintain optimal ASDIC contact with the deep U-boat, then directed Magpie by voice radio, "Steer 045. Increase speed to 8 knots. Fire on my command." Walker's ASDIC operators tracked both the submarine and Magpie simultaneously, calculating the geometry in real time. When the solution looked right, Walker transmitted, "Fire Hedgehog now." Magpie fired. The Hedgehog projectiles arced through the air and plunged into the sea. There was a tense silence. Hedgehog projectiles only exploded on contact, so if the attack missed, there would be no detonations at all. Then 2 sharp, distinct explosions erupted from the depths. Direct hits. Walker later wrote in his report, "I was highly tickled by this Hedgehog airy. It was typical Walker, dry British understatement concealing fierce satisfaction." Starling then closed for a final depth charge attack, expending the last of its charges.
U-238 imploded.
50 men died. 3 U-boats destroyed in one night. The crews were exhausted, shaken by the close calls with the homing torpedoes, but triumphant. And they were not finished. On February 11th, Starling and Wild Goose encountered U-424, another type WWII submarine. The engagement was shorter than previous battles, only 4 hours of pursuit, but it demonstrated the lethal efficiency of Walker's methods. Multiple creeping attacks forced U-424 to surface, where it was destroyed by gunfire. 51 men were killed. Only 2 survived. 8 days later, on February 19th, the second support group achieved its 6th and final kill of the patrol. U-264, a type WWII submarine, was detected by ASDIC and subjected to a massive barrage attack involving 4 ships. Over 70 depth charges were dropped in rapid succession. The cumulative shock effect was overwhelming. U-264's pressure hull failed in multiple locations simultaneously. Compartments flooded. Battery rooms generated chlorine gas. The submarine lost all depth control and surfaced involuntarily, its crew in complete disarray. Starling and her consorts picked up 34 survivors, many injured, from the stricken vessel. The submarine sank minutes later. 6 U-boats destroyed in 3 weeks. Walker's group had expended over 400 depth charges and nearly all their Hedgehog ammunition. The ships returned to Gladstone Dock on February 22, 1944, to a hero's welcome. The First Lord of the Admiralty was present at dockside to greet them personally. Crowds lined the quays. Walker's seniority as a captain was backdated from June 30, 1942 to June 30, 1940, an extraordinary honor that effectively gave him 2 years of seniority in a single stroke. He was awarded a second bar to his DSO. The citation praised his outstanding leadership, skill, and determination, and noted that his group had achieved the highest success rate against U-boats of any unit in the Royal Navy. Multi-role impact, the transformation of anti-submarine warfare. The success of Walker's tactics forced a fundamental reassessment of anti-submarine warfare doctrine across the Royal Navy and Allied navies. The statistics were undeniable. In 1941, depth charge attacks succeeded approximately 5% of the time under ideal conditions and 3% in actual combat. By early 1944, the success rate had risen to between 20 and 45%, depending on circumstances and the skill of the attacking force. Walker's second support group achieved success rates even higher. Approximately 60% of their attacks resulted in confirmed kills or severe damage, forcing the U-boat to abort its patrol. The creeping attack was adopted as standard procedure throughout Western Approaches Command. Training schools at HMS Osprey and other facilities began teaching the method to all escort groups. The coordination required was demanding, but the results justified the effort. Escort commanders who had spent years frustrated by their inability to hold ASDIC contact during attacks now had a solution. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was enormous. German after-action reports began to include references to silent attacks and ghost escorts that seemed to approach undetected. Morale in the U-boat service, which had remained high through years of mounting losses, began to crack. The barrage attack remained more controversial. It was undeniably effective, but the resource expenditure troubled supply officers. Depth charges had to be manufactured, transported to forward bases, loaded onto ships, all of which required labor, materials, and shipping space in a war where resources were always scarce. Critics pointed out that a barrage attack consuming 70 depth charges might sink one submarine, but those same 70 charges distributed among 7 ships could provide 10 charges each for multiple attacks. Wouldn't that be more efficient? Walker's response was documented in several memoranda and after-action reports. Efficiency, he argued, was measured in dead U-boats, not in charges expended per attack. A conventional attack that used 10 charges and failed to sink the submarine was not efficient. It was a waste of 10 charges. The submarine survived, returned to base, was repaired, and went back out to sink more ships. A barrage attack that used 70 charges and destroyed the submarine was supremely efficient, because that submarine would never sink another ship. Moreover, Walker noted the psychological impact of the barrage attack extended beyond the immediate target. U-boat crews that survived barrage attacks, or that heard about them from survivors, learned that diving deep was no longer a safe refuge. This affected their behavior, making them more likely to flee when attacked rather than go deep and wait it out, which in turn made them more vulnerable to other forms of attack, including aircraft. The data supported Walker's argument. Between January and June 1943, before Walker's tactics became widely adopted, 554 depth charge attacks were conducted by Royal Navy escorts, resulting in 27.5 confirmed kills. Some U-boats were destroyed by attacks from multiple ships, hence the fractional numbers. That was a 5% success rate. In the last 6 months of 1943, as Walker's methods began to spread through the fleet, 897 attacks resulted in 48 kills, 5.3%, a modest improvement. But in 1944, as the creeping and barrage attacks became standard procedure and more crews mastered the techniques, 2,023 attacks resulted in 130 kills, a 6.4% success rate overall, with elite units like Walker's achieving rates 3 to 4 times higher. And more significantly, the percentage of attacks that resulted in damage forcing the U-boat to abort its mission rose from approximately 10% to over 30%. Submarines that survived attacks were increasingly forced to limp back to base for repairs, reducing the number of operational boats in the Atlantic at any given time. The adoption of Walker's tactics coincided with other improvements in anti-submarine warfare: better radar for detecting surfaced U-boats, improved ASDIC equipment that maintained contact at closer ranges, forward-throwing weapons like Hedgehog and Squid that eliminated the blind spot problem, the breaking of German naval codes allowing convoys to be routed around known U-boat positions, long-range aircraft that could patrol farther into the mid-Atlantic gap, where air cover had previously been unavailable, and escort carriers that provided convoys with their own air support. But Walker's tactical innovations were the critical factor that turned improved technology into battlefield success. Technology provided better tools. Walker showed how to use them. The tactics spread beyond the Royal Navy. The United States Navy, which operated its own escort groups in the Atlantic, sent observers to study Walker's methods and adopted modified versions of the creeping attack for their destroyer escorts. The Royal Canadian Navy, which provided a significant portion of the Atlantic convoy escorts, incorporated the tactics into their training programs. By mid-1944, the creeping attack and variations of the barrage attack were standard operating procedure across all Allied anti-submarine forces in the Atlantic. The psychological aftermath: terror in the depths. The impact on German U-boat crews was profound and well documented in interrogation reports and post-war memoirs. Submarine service had always been dangerous. The crews knew and accepted that. But through 1942 and into early 1943, the dangers had been predictable and somewhat manageable. Depth charges were frightening but rarely fatal. Aircraft were dangerous but could be avoided by diving. Convoy escorts could be evaded with skill and nerve. The U-boat service maintained high morale because, despite losses, the submarines were winning the Atlantic battle. By late 1943 and early 1944, that had changed. Interrogation reports from survivors of Walker's attacks documented their psychological state. One officer from U-264 stated, "We could not understand how they knew where we were at every moment. We changed course, changed depth, stopped engines, nothing worked. The attacks never stopped. After 8 hours, we were certain we would die." A crewman from U-734 reported, "The explosions came from all directions at once. It was not like depth charge attacks we had experienced before. The boat shook like it would break apart. We could hear the hull plating cracking. Water came in everywhere. The fear was spreading." U-boat crews began to dread encounters with British escort groups, particularly those operating in the western approaches where Walker's influence was strongest. The German Naval Command noted in intelligence summaries that crews were increasingly reporting that British attacks had become more determined and more accurate. Admiral Donitz himself acknowledged in conference notes from early 1944 that the enemy has improved his methods considerably and that losses were becoming unsustainable. The mathematics of U-boat warfare had shifted decisively. In 1942, a U-boat on its first patrol had approximately a 75% chance of returning to base. By late 1943, that had dropped to 50%. By mid-1944, first patrol survival rates were below 30%. The average U-boat was sunk after 4 patrols. The average age of U-boat crewmen dropped steadily as experienced veterans were killed and replaced by increasingly young, poorly trained recruits. Training time was cut from 9 months to 6, then to 4, as the need for crews grew desperate. These inexperienced crews were far less capable of executing the complex evasion tactics that had worked earlier in the war, which made them even more vulnerable to attack. The psychological toll extended to Donitz himself. As commander of the U-boat force and later as commander-in-chief of the entire German Navy, he faced impossible choices. Every U-boat sent to the Atlantic had a diminishing chance of success and an increasing likelihood of being sunk. But withdrawing the submarines from the Atlantic would allow the Allies to run convoys unmolested, shipping unlimited supplies to Britain and building up forces for the invasion of Europe. Donitz was caught in a strategic trap. He continued to send U-boats out because the alternative was to surrender the Atlantic without a fight. But the cost in men and boats was staggering. In 1944 alone, 242 U-boats were lost, more than in any previous year of the war. Of the 1,154 U-boats commissioned during the entire war, 781 were destroyed, a loss rate of 68%. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in U-boats, Nearly 30,000 were killed, a 75% fatality rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during the Second World War. On the British side, the psychological impact was equally profound but opposite in nature. For years, escort crews had felt helpless, watching merchant ships burn, plucking survivors from the freezing water, dropping depth charges that achieved nothing. Now they were winning. Walker became a celebrity in Britain. Newspapers ran stories about the U-boat killer and his methods. His ships became famous. Sailors volunteered to serve in the second support group. The tune, "A Hunting We Will Go," which Walker had adopted as the group's unofficial anthem, was played on radio broadcasts. When Walker's ships entered or left port, they played it over the ship's public address system, and dockside crowds would cheer. It was psychological warfare of a sort, a public statement that the Royal Navy was no longer on the defensive but hunting aggressively. The enduring legacy, what happened after. In March 1944, Walker's second support group was assigned to protect Arctic convoy JW-58, a massive operation carrying supplies to the Soviet Union via Murmansk. The convoy consisted of 49 merchant ships escorted by 32 warships, including 2 escort carriers and 2 flotillas of fleet destroyers. It was one of the most heavily protected convoys of the entire war. Walker's group operated independently from the main convoy screen, ranging ahead and on the flanks to hunt U-boats before they could reach the merchant ships. On March 29th, Starling sank U-961. The group then sank U-360 and U-288 in quick succession. The convoy reached Murmansk without losing a single ship, a remarkable achievement given that earlier Arctic convoys had suffered devastating losses. The return convoy, RA-58, also arrived in Britain without loss, though poor weather prevented any U-boat contacts. Walker's final operation was in support of Operation Neptune, the naval component of the D-Day landings in Normandy. Between June 1st and June 15th, 1944, the second support group patrolled the western approaches to the English Channel, forming part of the anti-submarine screen protecting the enormous invasion fleet. German U-boats attempted repeatedly to break through and attack the landing ships. None succeeded in getting past Walker's cordon. Several were sunk or damaged and forced to withdraw. But Walker himself was dying. For 3 weeks, he commanded his ships with barely any sleep, refusing to leave the bridge, driving himself to exhaustion. He had always been relentless, but since his son's death in 1943, colleagues noted that he seemed to have lost any sense of self-preservation. He worked himself beyond human limits. On June 13, 1944, he was awarded the 3rd bar to his DSO, an almost unprecedented honor, making him one of the most decorated officers in the Royal Navy. On June 20th, he was again mentioned in dispatches. But by early July, Walker was visibly unwell. He suffered severe headaches and fatigue. On July 7, 1944, he suffered a cerebral thrombosis, a blood clot in the brain. He was rushed to the Royal Naval Hospital at Seaforth, Merseyside, but there was nothing the doctors could do. Frederic John Walker died on July 9, 1944, at the age of 48. The official cause of death was listed as overwork and exhaustion. His funeral on July 14, 1944, was extraordinary. Approximately 1,000 people attended the service at Liverpool Cathedral, which was conducted with full naval honors. A naval procession then escorted the coffin through the streets of Liverpool to the pier head on the River Mersey. Crowds lined the entire route. The coffin was embarked aboard the destroyer HMS Hesperus for burial at sea, a rare honor usually reserved for admirals. Walker's own ships, the second support group, had already departed for their next patrol, continuing the hunt he had taught them. The naval personnel who manned the funeral procession were largely from the Royal Canadian Navy, whose ships had worked alongside Walker's in the Atlantic campaign. Walker's final record stood at 20 U-boats destroyed, the highest individual total of any anti-submarine commander in history. But his true legacy was not the number he sank himself but the methods he developed and taught to others. The creeping attack and barrage attack remained in use for the rest of the war and influenced anti-submarine doctrine for decades afterward. When the Royal Navy developed the Squid anti-submarine mortar, a forward-throwing weapon that could maintain ASDIC contact during attack, The tactical employment drew heavily on Walker's coordinated attack principles. Modern anti-submarine warfare, with its emphasis on multi-platform coordination and sustained prosecution of contacts, descends directly from the methods Walker pioneered. The impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was decisive. In May 1943, Donitz had been forced to withdraw U-boats from the North Atlantic temporarily after losing 43 submarines in a single month. When the submarines returned, they faced Walker's tactics and those of commanders trained in his methods. U-boat losses continued to mount. By the end of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had effectively been won. Convoys were getting through with minimal losses. The statistical crossover point, where more U-boats were being sunk than Allied merchant ships, occurred in May 1943 and never reversed. Post-war analysis by the British Admiralty's historical section examined the factors that led to Allied victory in the Atlantic. The report identified 6 critical elements: improved radar, breaking of German naval codes, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, improved anti-submarine weapons, and, significantly, the development of coordinated attack tactics that eliminated the ASDIC blind spot. Walker's methods were specifically cited as transforming depth charges from relatively ineffective weapons into submarine killers. The German perspective was equally clear. Vice Admiral Eberhard Gott, who served as Chief of Operations for the U-boat command under Donitz, stated in post-war interrogations, by 1944, it had become almost impossible for a U-boat to survive sustained pursuit by a competent escort group. The British had learned to maintain contact through all our evasion maneuvers. Once they had us, they would not let go. We lost boats that had survived dozens of previous attacks. Something fundamental had changed in their methods. The human cost of the Battle of the Atlantic was staggering on both sides. Approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships were sunk, along with 175 Allied warships. Over 36,000 Allied merchant seamen and 36,000 Royal Navy and Allied naval personnel were killed. The German U-boat service suffered proportionally worse. 783 U-boats destroyed and approximately 30,000 men killed out of 40,000 who served. It was a war of attrition fought in darkness and cold water, where survival often depended on which side could adapt faster to new tactics and technology. Walker's tactics represented that adaptation in its purest form. He took existing technology, ASDIC, depth charges, escort vessels, and used them in ways that had not been attempted before. He violated conventional wisdom about resource allocation and doctrine. He trained his crews to standards that other commanders thought excessive. And he proved, in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable combat against a skilled, determined enemy, that his methods worked. The last U-boat sunk by Walker's second support group was U-333, destroyed on July 31, 1944, 3 weeks after Walker's death. The group continued operations through the end of the war in Europe in May 1945, adding more kills to their record. The ships were eventually decommissioned or transferred to other duties. HMS Starling survived the war and was broken up for scrap in 1965. Wild Goose became a training ship and was scrapped in 1956. The others met similar fates. Walker was survived by his wife Eileen and their 4 children. His eldest son, Timothy, had been killed aboard HMS Parthian in 1943. His second son, Gillichrist, served in the Royal Navy and survived the war. His youngest son, John, later joined the Navy as well. His daughter, also named Eileen, remembered her father as a man who loved his family deeply, but who was consumed by his sense of duty. He could not rest, she said in later interviews, while there were U-boats sinking our ships and killing our people. The war took him from us long before he died. In the decades after the war, Walker's reputation grew as historians studied the Battle of the Atlantic in detail. Books were written about him, memorials erected. In Liverpool, where the Western Approaches Command had its headquarters and where Walker's ships were based, he is remembered as one of the city's great heroes. The Captain F.J. Walker Memorial Window was installed in Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. Streets and buildings were named in his honor. The Royal Navy established the Frederic John Walker Prize, awarded annually to the officer or rating judged most proficient in anti-submarine warfare. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is doctrinal. Modern anti-submarine warfare is fundamentally cooperative. Ships, helicopters, and maritime patrol aircraft work together, sharing sensor data in real time, coordinating attacks from multiple platforms, prosecuting contacts until the submarine is destroyed or positively lost. This approach, multi-platform coordination, sustained prosecution, overwhelming force, is Walker's approach, evolved through technology but unchanged in philosophy. When nuclear submarines hunt diesel-electric submarines in today's oceans, when surface action groups coordinate their anti-submarine assets, when helicopter crews work with ship-based sonar operators to triangulate a contact, they are executing tactical concepts that Walker pioneered 80 years ago in the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy eventually acknowledged that the so-called forbidden tactics, forbidden not by explicit order but by resource constraints and conventional wisdom, had been the key to victory. The creeping attack became Tactical Instruction 172, part of the official anti-submarine warfare doctrine. The barrage attack, while never formalized to the same degree, was recognized as appropriate in circumstances where the target was deep-diving or particularly elusive. Future generations of anti-submarine commanders studied Walker's after-action reports and patrol logs as essential texts. In the end, the story of Walker's depth-charge tactics is a story about innovation under pressure, about challenging conventional wisdom when lives are at stake, and about the power of relentless determination. The technology existed. The weapons existed. What was needed was someone willing to use them in new ways, to train crews to new standards, to exhaust every resource in pursuit of victory. Walker was that person. He paid for it with his health and ultimately his life. But the convoys got through. The U-boats were defeated. Britain survived. And the methods he developed changed naval warfare forever. On February 9, 1944, when HMS Starling hunted that U-boat through 6 hours of darkness and winter gales, when Walker ordered his ships into positions that had never been attempted before, when the depth charges fell in patterns that German submariners had never experienced. In that moment and thousands of moments like it, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic turned. Not through technological miracles or intelligence breakthroughs alone, but through the tactical brilliance of a man who understood that innovation required not just new ideas but the courage to execute them despite resistance, despite cost, despite exhaustion. Captain Frederic John Walker gave the Royal Navy the tools to win the longest battle of the Second World War. The price was steep. The victory was absolute.